25,000 subscribers. That's a milestone, and you know what that means. You had the opportunity to ask me the questions, and I'll do my very best to answer as many as possible. What do I think of the 321 Speedmaster Ed White? Can you trust watch YouTubers? How do you end flipping? And a whole lot more. Just to get this started, with 25,000 subscribers, the reality is I can't get through all the questions you've asked me. I'd be here for 6 hours, so I've chosen a subset of them. Others I've answered in the previous videos that I've got linked below in the description. Some of the questions are so interesting that I've actually added them to a list of topics that will turn into full videos in the future. Regardless though, I just want to say thank you for the support. I really appreciate the support that I've received from my channel, and I also really enjoy interacting with you guys in the comments. Your support is overwhelming, and also it's incredibly positive. So just thank you. As with all these Q&A videos, I try to do these videos as off the cuff and with as little preparation as possible. So there's going to be a little bit less B-roll and a little bit less visual diversity. And also, you know, there might be a couple of places where I say a date or a diameter size or something that's I misstate. So don't kill me for that in the comments. Let's dive in. Biltong or braai? Those of you that don't know, I'm a born and raised South African. I don't live there anymore, but it is my spiritual homeland. Biltong is a far superior South African version of ostensibly American beef jerky. Braai is, well, basically a barbecue, but not quite. And the answer? Both. I can't choose because I live in Europe. Half the year I don't see sunlight. Biltong is ridiculously hard to get a hold of, and the weather is rarely conducive to a good braai. If I want boerewors, pretty much my only option is to make it from scratch, and that's a bit of a palaver. So whenever I have the option for either biltong or braai, I just have to save the moment because it doesn't happen that often in Scandinavia. Can you trust YouTubers? The actual question was a little bit more nuanced, and it refers to how the democratization of platforms like YouTube, whether or not they are good for the exchange of watch information. Probably unsurprising to those of you that have been around for a while, I have a mental model for this, and it starts with two dimensions. One is about entertainment versus knowledge exchange, and the other one is data and facts versus opinion and perceptions. Think of Nico Leonard, who I watch and I enjoy immensely. He's clearly entertainment, and for the most part, he's in the opinion space. ID Guy, who I also enjoy a lot, is also not heavy on data and facts and metrics and numbers, but he definitely leans more into knowledge over pure, unadulterated entertainment. You can ask yourself, where's Adrian Barker? Where's Watch Outside? Where's Red Dead Restoration? Where's Britt Pierce? For me, the more someone leans into the entertainment piece, the less I'm concerned about trust. Nico's doing his best to be fun. He's completely open about having a company on the side that sells watches. He's totally explicit about the sponsorships he has, but he's not trying to be anything but entertaining. It doesn't mean he doesn't know what he's talking about, but his knowledge and his insight is not necessarily at the core of what his channel's about. It's about entertainment. When it comes to channels that are heavily data orientated, it's not particularly common in the watch space. The reason isn't really that complicated. If you're, I don't know, Linus Tech Tips, when you're reviewing a PC or a graphics card or a case, you to a large extent have a lot of data, and it's a much more data-driven exercise. You've got memory speeds and upgradability and heat dissipation. There's a ton of objective or more or less objective factors that go into assessing the quality of a given PC product. And compared to watches, there are far more objective factors. A watch isn't about the data. I know people do care about accuracy and water resistance, but most watch purchases are subjective and emotional. They're about aesthetics and brand and identity. This is why Seiko sells, despite everybody agreeing, well, not everybody, but a lot of people agreeing that their accuracy is challenged. And at best, their bracelets are often subpar. The ratio of personal perception versus objective criteria in watches doesn't lend itself heavily to data-driven conclusions when it comes to buying a watch. So where's the problem in terms of trust? Well, it's in the opinion space. It's where someone you like and trust says something about a watch and you have concerns as to how influenced they are by a brand that possibly sent them the watch. The obvious question is, are there brands that will pay you to speak positively about your watch? Sure, absolutely. I know this because I get emails every now and again, now that I'm slightly larger as a channel, where people offer things to me to make a positive review. But it's not the majority by far, or at least not the ones that have been writing to me. It's few and far between. Most of them don't do that. But it doesn't really matter because the influence is softer, and to some extent, I think it's self-regulating. And I think the best way I can illustrate it is to asking you this question. If somebody consistently speaks badly about you, what are the odds of you inviting them to your birthday party? It's going to be less, right? So if I constantly bash JLC, what are the odds that JLC will want to send me their watches? I mean, I wouldn't fault them if it crossed their mind, because if he's just going to bash our watch, why would we send it? It's not good press for them. But it's also self-regulating. If I or any other YouTuber has a good relationship with the brand and I want to talk about their watches, will I completely voluntarily hold off from being too negative out of fear that I'll lose access? It's a perfectly reasonable thing to consider. There is a level of symbiosis between the person that talks about the watch, and that's whether it's a YouTuber or a print channel or a blog to watch or Hodinkee or whatever. There's going to be this give and take between being impartial and independent versus having access. But then there's the other piece, and I have this dilemma. I don't do a lot of reviews, but when I do, I always get one or two comments that say, how can you talk about a watch when you're just using company B-roll? I always state in my videos that if it's in the review section in my review playlist, then I've had hands-on, either through a friend or down at the AD. But some people will be inclined to trust me less simply because I haven't got videos of the watch that I've made myself, which adds another dilemma. If I want to make better B-roll, then I need to call a manufacturer and I have to ask if I can loan a watch. And if I do that, then I have a relationship. And how do I keep that relationship so they can send me other watches? So some people there might think I'm selling out, which is not what I would be thinking I was doing, but it's going to be a dilemma because either way you do it, you are in some way affecting your perception or other people's perception of you. But overall, I'm not really concerned for two key reasons. One, I don't use one source for my own decision making. I read a lot of newspapers about world news. I watch different reviewers of the Apple Vision Pro, and I watch a lot of watch-related YouTube content. I'm informed enough not to be manipulated by one single watch YouTuber. Secondly, watches are, like I said, a subjective piece. There's not a right or a wrong. It's like movies. Whether you like or don't like the new Star Wars movies has zero bearing on my opinion of the movie. It's same with the watch. If I like Hublot, I like Hublot. And no amount of Nico Leonard telling me that it's trash is going to change that. I can appreciate his points that are, that they're heavy on branding. I can agree that a Solita movement in an $8,000 watch is ridiculous. But some of their watches, to me, look cool. When it comes to something like cars, gas mileage, and EV mileage, a reviewer that states a specific mileage per gallon based on their own driving is going to be incredibly important because mileage is a huge piece of the buying decision for a lot of people when it comes to their car. But whether some YouTuber likes or doesn't like some particular watch, if it looks good on my wrist, I'm going to buy it anyway. So if you're just a little bit critical about watching things and getting a couple of more sources, and at the end of the day, you always go down to the AD and you always put it on your wrist, then I think you'll be fine. Then there's the last piece as to whether or not YouTube is in-depth enough. Well, yes and no. I mean, there are channels like me and ID Guy that go fairly in-depth, and there are channels that are a little bit more on the surface. I think both have a value. Some people are going to think I'm incredibly boring and intellectual and nerdy, and other people are going to find the other types of channels, superficial and not having a lot of content and not really adding any sort of things that people can figure out for themselves. I think both have value, and I think both things contribute to people having an idea about what do they want to spend their time on, and maybe, drool over watches that they'll never be able to own, or just, have a general idea of whether or not they should bother going down to the AD and just trying out the watch. Why is Seiko loved? They're loved because they've been around for a long time. They are loved because they make nice watches. But I think the key, and this applies to both Seiko and Casio, they're perceived as everyman's watch companies. Everybody can get a G-Shock or a Seiko, and there's a Seiko for everybody. Seiko is one of the absolute few brands, even when you include Grand Seiko in their lineup, that has an offering at virtually every single conceivable price point. JLC is upper mid-range price for all models, with small peaks in high complications. Omega is upper mid as well and also have high complications, but there's not a $500 Omega offering. Tudor's mid-range, Longines is mid-range, Christopher Ward is lower mid. But Seiko, you can get it for $500, you can get it for $1,000, $2,000, $5,000, and if you go to Grand Seiko, you can get it for $50,000. They have every price range. I honestly think people find that charming and accessible. It also connects, I think, to the quartz crisis. After the quartz crisis, all the Swiss brands that survived basically tried to go upmarket to become luxury, to differentiate themselves from those pesky quartz watches. And that meant that brands that before might have been accessible became inaccessible and even more aspirational. Seiko didn't. They just kind of stuck to their guns and have always, and I think that's a big part of their appeal, they've always been seen as independent, of course, from Swiss, but also just very much still focused on making something that people will like at more or less every price point. I think people like the humility that they signal. It's even the same with Grand Seiko. Their standard options are priced really well for the specs you get, but the whole design ethos is about perfection and simplicity and not flashiness and showiness. And that just speaks to that humility and accessibility. As a new collector, should I buy cheap or wait and buy the big watch? That's an impossible question. I think you just have to accept that if you're going to get into watch collecting, you're going to make some mistakes and you are going to buy some things that you will eventually regret. It's part of the learning process. It reminds me of those narratives of how people's perceptions of Rolex changes as their knowledge and experience grows. I had a lot of watches before I considered myself a watch enthusiast, but when I finally went down the rabbit hole explicitly, I made some mistakes. I bought watches that I never wore. I bought watches that were compromises of other watches I really wanted, and I also bought high-end watches that I bought and I thought I wanted them, but I never wore them. I actually once bought a Calatrava once and sold it within 6 months. I thought I wanted a Patek, but I'm just not a dress watch kind of guy. So I was constantly looking at this gorgeous Patek with Clou de Paris bezel, and I never wore it. But I owned a Patek, which I thought was something that was important to me, but I sold it. And then I bought a Lange instead, because their movements are so cool, and that was also a mistake for me. I hadn't learned from the Patek, so I almost instantly repeated the mistake on the Lange. So it got sold in the same year as the Patek. There is a lot of advice out there about not making these mistakes when you start out as a collector, and the advice is largely not wrong. But I think the point that people miss is that making the mistakes is part of the journey. And by not buying that cheap watch, you might not learn from your mistakes. And if you just wait for that one big watch, hoping it's going to be satisfying some itch, you never get to try other designs and models, and you get shoehorned into just being one kind of watch guy, which is fine, but you don't learn anything from avoiding potential mistakes. I liken it to the fact that you have to be the guy that walks up to the bar and speaks to that attractive girl and feel the humiliation of her giving you the look to learn. Am I saying you should wait until you have money for the big watch? No, I'm saying that you have to buy, and only when you buy will you figure out if it was the right choice or not. I can't tell you which one is the right decision. What are your guilty pleasure watches? I like the Hublot Sand Beige integrated bracelet ceramic Big Bang. I like it. It looks cool. I think it's cooler than the Mojave IWC Big Pilot. I know, it's a Hublot, but I don't care. I honestly think it looks cool. It's not top of my list, but there are quite a few Hublots that speak to me. They are over the top, and that's partly why I'm drawn to them, but there's also no doubt that I'm a little bit of a contrarian. When somebody says to me that something's terrible or sucks so you shouldn't buy it, I'm kind of drawn towards those things almost purely on principle, because nobody dictates what I wear or what's in my bookcase. I also like the AP Cactus Jack. I've only seen it online, but this particular AP looks cool. These days, we kind of all have to have some level of hate towards AP for watches like the Spider-Man and the AP Adex models. But this watch just looks cool. I've also got one other guilty pleasure, which is not so much about the watch, but more about the brand, and that's JLC. I've criticized them a fair bit for their pricing, but the Reverso chronograph is a watch that's on my shortlist. I'm hoping to find one below retail, but I like it so much that I'm honestly not necessarily against paying full price for it. I wouldn't do it for any other JLC, but this one I'm like really close. Top 5 best sports watches for the money. There's no such thing. Like I said, buying a watch is incredibly subjective and there isn't a right or wrong. Just to define a sports watch, from this one I'm saying steel bracelet, time and date only, so no chronograph or anything else, not a diver, and in no particular order, Rolex Datejust 41mm blue dial fluted bezel. Rolex technically calls this a classic watch, but to me it's a sports watch. I'd get it on the Oyster bracelet. It's an icon. It looks great. It's not impossible to get, although two-tone at the moment is probably still easier. You can hate on Rolex all you want, but this is an excellent option, and I would honestly choose it over an Aquaterra any day of the week, and I've actually owned both at one point. AP Rolex, out of this world, immaculate finishing, leagues ahead of anything Rolex can do, and honestly far more interesting than a Nautilus, which I think is a bit too restrained in comparison. Then there's the Nomus Club Sport, which also is an excellent option, especially in the 39mm version. I think it's great value, and it's still prettier than comparable offerings from brands like Longines and Tudor. Tudor have cooler divers, but the regular BBs are not standout offerings in my opinion. Christopher Ward has the Dune, but to me it's a little bit more of a field watch in general and not quite sporty enough for me. Same goes for the Longines Spirit. You know, they serve different demographics. Brands like Monteformix, they have some cool watches, but their field style watches are not sleek enough. They lean more chunky, which is not the look I associate with a sports watch. For me, a sports watch is not a Dodge Charger, it's a Porsche 911. It's not a muscle car, but a European sports car. Then there's the Bulgari Octofornissimo. I know, integrated sports watch, but it's amazing. The polished version is an absolute fingerprint magnet, but the matted version, which I own, is a joy to wear. But you do need an above average wrist because it's quite substantial, not so much in height, but in length and width. The height is like 6, 7, 8 millimeters. Okay, how many was that? Rolex, AP, okay, 4, 5. Cartier Santos medium white dial. It's a ridiculously cool watch. Those would be my options. Will there be a true disruptor in watchmaking? No, honestly no. I think I have to define disruption and the way I think of it. Apple disrupted the iPhone market or the phone market when they launched the iPhone and destroyed Nokia. Platforms like Uber and Airbnb haven't destroyed the taxi industry or the hotel industry, but they have definitely changed it. So those are disruptors. When it comes to the watch market in the last 10 years, we've seen 3 things that really have an impact. 1 is the Apple Watch and other connected wrist devices. 2 is the advent of online retailing, which allows smaller brands to reach a larger audience. And 3 is the democratization of production. Starting with the last one, if you have capital today, you can basically start a relatively decent watch brand fairly easily. You buy a movement from Sellita, you source a bracelet from Italy or India, you have someone in China mill you a case, and you find some indie enameling house in the Swiss Alps to make some dials for you. 10 years or so back, this started more with brands that were touting the whole direct-to-consumer, cutting out the middleman rubbish, which was basically associated with terrible fashion watches. But today, you get ridiculously high-quality products from relatively unknown brands. Swatch, Richemont, Rolex, LVMH, they don't have a massive lead in any area in terms of quality. If you wanted to, I do believe you could source your way to a watch of pure quality that was very, very close to a Rolex if you wanted to. Online retailing is a thing. More and more big brands are doing it. I don't see Patek or AP or Rolex doing it. It's counter to the way they want to be perceived, but everything below $10,000 should essentially be available online. It's not going to lead to lower prices, just higher margins for the brands and higher control. But online is so mature now that it's not like they're going to have a new platform that kills the rest. Also, I don't think leasing or short-term lending of watches will ever really catch on. So things are stable there. As for the Apple Watch, most data seems to indicate that the market has peaked. I think last year Apple or the markets in total sold 50 or 60 million watches, and that's massive compared to Rolex selling 1 million, but the sales have topped, and I don't see it rebounding. Connected watches are following the same kind of trend as the iPhone. They had a period of massive adoption, and my guess is now they're in a phase where those people that have one will at some point have to get a new one every couple of years, but there aren't a whole lot of new customers. They're still selling enough watches to impact the sub $2,000 watch brands, which are definitely on the weaker side. I think Rado likely have a harder time than Hamilton. I think Tissot, despite the success of the PRX, are a brand that don't convey luxury enough. And in a choice between a Tissot and an Apple Watch, I think a lot of people legitimately prefer the Apple Watch and see it not only as more practical, but also more luxury. But Rolex, IWC, Tudor, Longines, they'll be fine as long as they make watches that are aspirational and something that people like. My biggest concern, though, is actually about the democratization of production. I do feel sometimes that watches are becoming very samey. Brands are very similarly positioned in terms of the way they market themselves, and they are similarly positioned in terms of what they sell. Sure, the watches look different, but if I said to you, name me a brand for something that's affordable, that have a dive watch, a tool watch, and a sports offering in their lineup, and they have good bracelets, good specs, and Salita movements, and are edgy and modern, who would you think I was talking about? Is it Christopher Ward or Monta or Formex? A lot of these brands kind of bleed into each other in terms of how they position themselves. That's why I like somebody like Studio Underdog, although I'd likely probably never buy one of the watches, but they are trying to be different. Same with Anordain, which are going down the route of enamel dials, which is incredibly niche. We just have so many brands, conglomerates, indies, startups that all follow the same formula. It's not bad, but everything just kind of converges on the same market offerings and design choices. How do you end backdoor flipping? You don't. You can't. You can, but there's likely too much legislation and there would be too many legal compromises that would have to be made. But if you could, this is essentially what I think you would have to do. When you buy a watch, you have to submit proof of ID, address, everything. This would be registered globally with the brand, and whenever the watch is on warranty or at service, the owner is checked against the original owner's data. If it isn't, then you blacklist it forever. Basically, the brand forces you to ask permission to sell your watch. They could even withhold the box and papers, so it's harder to sell. I think that's essentially what Patek, I don't know if they still do it, but they did it for a while. But practically speaking, you can't do that at a larger scale. If you're buying from a dealer, at least in Europe and likely in the US as well, you are not required to give a whole lot of personal information. Also in Europe, a dealer is not allowed to pass on that information to a manufacturer or any other third party. So unless you buy the data online, it's not going to be in the hands of the brand. Second, I don't think any consumer protection agency in Europe is ever going to allow a manufacturer to limit the user's right to sell what they own. I have a tough time even seeing US state or federal institutions saying that you're not allowed to sell what you own. I think Tesla tried to put a clause into the Cybertruck sales where they said you couldn't sell the watch for a year. But as far as I know, the last I read is they withdrew that resale clause. And I don't know why, but chances are it was problematic. So as long as people are willing to buy from flippers, then there will be someone willing and able to flip. Flippers are annoying, but for me, I just know that I wait 6 months to a year and then the new Speedy in white will be available in stores and over time it will be available below retail. My solution to flippers in that case is not giving into the hype and just waiting them out. One and done affordable watch. There's no such thing. There's also no such thing as a 3-watch collection, at least not for watch enthusiasts. If you're a watch lover and watch enthusiast, you will never be happy with 1 or 3 watches. You might have just one watch, but it'll be replaced at some point. And those with 3 watches will also be replaced at some point. It's the nature of changing tastes, changing interests, and desire for variety. Everybody that I know that has only one watch is not a watch nerd. These people have a watch, they like it, maybe they splurged on a Speedmaster and they treasure it, but they're not down the rabbit hole in the same way as a real watch collector. I mean, okay, so maybe there are maybe some people that are watch enthusiasts and know a ton about watches, and they maybe have a vintage sub or a vintage Speedy or some other watch that has sentimental value to them, and somehow they have the willpower to be in this community without spending money on other watches, but they are likely not in the majority, and there's no commonality in terms of watches. It's not just Speedies or Datejusts. Their tastes are varied and unique. So if you're one of those people that is capable of being in this hobby without buying more than one watch, then I salute you. That's impulse control on a whole other level. I don't know how you do it. I definitely can't. Why can't you get Rolex at the AD? Well, technically speaking, at the moment you can, at least some models. You still can't get a Submariner or a Daytona, but more and more models are becoming available. Two-tone is definitely available, and Datejusts, OPs, and some of the models are getting a whole lot easier recently because of the downturn in the market to actually get. But having said that, the reason you can't get a Rolex is because there are more customers for Rolex than there are Rolex watches produced. Rolex is the most popular mechanical watch brand in the world. It's indisputable. 30% of all Swiss watches in value are Rolex. A lot of people are angry at Rolex because of flippers, because they can't get the watches from ADs, because ADs sometimes are rude or arrogant or condescending. People ascribe all sorts of negative intentions to Rolex, but the absolute simplest fact is more people want a Rolex than Rolex can currently produce. We can discuss at length whether Rolex likes being sold out everywhere, whether they see it as a net positive or a net negative, but it doesn't change the fact that they are objectively highly desirable. Which leads me to some of the sub-questions that I have for myself to the overarching question, which is Rolex manufacturing scarcity? Are they holding back on producing models to not meet demand and drive up prices? No, I don't think so. Somebody in the comments are going to call me naive, but I have never been in a company that did not want to give customers what they wanted. Rolex doesn't want watches on the shelves that are unsold, but to underdeliver is not in their interest, and I don't think that's how they want it to be. And if they wanted to, they could have raised prices significantly higher on the Daytona, and they didn't. If Rolex could sell 2 million watches, I think they'd do it. That's also why they are expanding production. They have or will have a site ready in 2029 that I think in terms of square meters will double their footprint in terms of production capacity. So I don't think it's unreasonable to think that they will also be able to close to double their actual output. And chances are by that time, in 5 years' time, they will likely still not be able to meet demand. Second question is, are they producing enough of the right models? A lot of people want a Daytona. We know that Rolex produces 1.21 million watches a year. We know there are 50, 60, 70 million millionaires in the world. And we know that there are about 2,000 ADs in the world. So, question, how many people walk into an AD every day and say, I want to buy a Daytona, do you have one? Let's just, for the sake of argument, start with saying that for those 2,000 ADs across the world with 60 million millionaires, one person a day walks in and says, I can afford a Daytona, I want a Daytona. 2,000 ADs, 365 days a year, that's 730 something thousand watches. That's 70% of what Rolex produces. Maybe one a day is drastic, but let's just halve that. You're still at 350, 360,000 watches or requests for a Daytona. There was no way at the peak of the hype that Rolex was ever going to be able to deliver on the demand for the Daytona or the Submariner or the Blue Dial Datejust. Not defending the ADs, but they don't have control either. When it comes to Rolex, ADs do not, like other brands, have the option to order what they want. They get to fill out a wish list, and then Rolex decides what they get allocated. ADs never know what's going to show up. So they may send in a wish list, but what they actually can can be completely different. And if they already received their allocation of 3 Daytonas this year, they're not going to get any more. I've even heard from multiple independent sources that Rolex doesn't allocate based on price or margin. So whether the AD requests 1 Platinum Day Date or 1 Oyster Perpetual, they basically count equally towards their overall allocation. This likely also drives a certain behavior in terms of how you shape your wish list as an AD. Fourth sub-question, are Rolex exerting more control? Definitely. Buying Bucherer is about having more control in the value chain. Supporting the pre-owned by Rolex program is about control. Rolex wants to exercise better control in how customers perceive the buying experience at the AD. Rolex want better insight into who's buying their watches, and they want some level of influence on the secondary market. The nature of the market means they'll likely never get full control, but they would like to micromanage as much as possible. Especially for Rolex, it seems very much in their nature. What do I think of the Speedmaster Ed White? The Speedmaster Ed White, for those of you that don't know, is a limited edition Speedmaster that costs around double that of a regular Speedy. It's got a space backstory just like the Moonwatch. It's a little bit smaller. It doesn't have the signature curved lugs of the regular Moonwatch. And most importantly, it has a different movement, the 3-2-1. I'll let you Google the 3-2-1 movement and its historical significance, its Lemania origins, all of that kind of stuff. For me, the short version is it's a gorgeous movement. I'm not a big movement buff, but I can appreciate the aesthetic. Most automatic movements are boring to look at. There's a big old 3/4 plate and a giant rotor in the way. Manual movements, like the one in the regular Speedy, just look more intricate, and the 3-2-1 just looks ridiculously complicated and is good looking in a uniquely mechanical way. The Ed White itself is a difficult call for me because I prefer the regular Speedy design, except for maybe the size. I prefer the regular Speedy bracelet as well, but the movement in the 3-2-1 is just nicer. I'm just not sure that I would appreciate it enough to justify the purchase, because for me, that should be the reason to buy it. Why do we wear mechanical watches? This is going to have to be the last question. Why do we wear mechanical watches? Marques Brownlee did a video on the Apple Watch Ultra, and he said something that resonated with me. He said that a large part of what the Apple Watch Ultra over the regular Apple Watch does is not something that a whole lot of people are actually going to use. The real use case for its features target a very small market segment, but the reality is that it's not targeted at the people that are going to use those features. He said it was targeted at those people that see themselves as the kind of people that would have an Ultra. So it's not necessarily the guy that runs the Marathon des Sables in the Sahara Desert, but rather the guy that sees himself as this outdoors ultra sportsman kind of person. He buys the image of being an ultra watch owner. Taking it a step further, I also thought how many people actually use a lot of the functions on their Apple Watch, messengers and calendars and timers and all that other stuff. Some people do, I'm sure, but I see so many people wear them, and most of them, when I ask them, the answer I get is, it tells the time, I get a notification, and then I check my phone. And also it's cool that it's got a step counter. Most people use an absolute fraction of the functionality of the Apple Watch. So why do they buy it? Ostensibly, it's the same reason as the mechanical watch. It's the perfect intersection between practicality, jewelry, and status. Especially as a man, a watch is still the most widely accepted form of jewelry you can wear in pretty much any culture. A watch, whether you like it or not, can communicate status if you want it to. And it's practical. It tells the time. And a mechanical watch, well, we've been convinced that mechanical is exclusive, better, more authentic, more real than quartz. We've been convinced, and I am convinced, of the nostalgia of the movement, which isn't entirely unjustified. Mechanical watches are some of the most reliable and longest lasting instruments in the world. These things literally just keep on ticking with minor intervention. That's almost inherently cool, especially in a day and age where everything is disposable and in many cases built with planned obsolescence built in. Which brings me to a story. I've got a good friend, And I was talking to him a while ago, and he has a Speedmaster. It's his only watch. He's not a watch enthusiast, and we were just talking, the two of us and one other friend. Now, the other guy, he does not understand luxury watches at all. He thinks it's exorbitant, it's extravagant, it's wasteful. He does not see the appeal at all. So he asks my Speedmaster friend, why spend so much on a chunk of metal? And he said, I'm not a watch guy, but every morning I put this watch on, and I know this is one of the things I've treated myself to. I wind it. I know there's something inside that ticks. And every day it goes on the wrist and I feel special. I don't understand the history of it. The AD babbled on about something about the moon. It didn't really interest me. But this was a significant purchase for me. And I treated myself. And I relish it every single day. So that's why. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks a ton for the support, and also I'm looking forward to interacting with you even more. Let me know what you think of the topics and my thoughts in the comments. Like, subscribe. Cheers.